Alright, welcome back. In this video, we will take a look at how to use different layouts in WxPython. We will take a look at both box sizes as well as grid sizes to be able to lay out your widgets differently. And finally, at the end, we will build a simple login form to put together all of the things that we have learned. And I will give a quick recap and comparison of all of the different layouts. So to start, I have some starter code here. This just creates a simple window. You can find it in the GitHub link below. It is under the file called boxsizer example.py. And to help understand why we need different layouts or sizes as it is called in WxPython, we will position a button manually. We can create this button by using wx.button, and it expects a parent, which in this case is the panel object, a label as the text, and then specifying the position that we want to position it at, for example 100 by 100. This positions it 100 units away from the top right hand corner vertically and horizontally. But the reason why this is highly not recommended is because it does not scale as we resize it, and this also doesn't work out in the long run, since if we add more widgets, we need to position all of them manually, and if we make a single change to them, we'll need to change all of them. So much better way, especially if you want to add more widgets, is to use a boxsizer. A boxsizer is used to lay out all of our widgets either entirely vertically or entirely horizontally. We will first look at how to align all of them vertically. So to do that, we will create a variable to store the layout, or the sizer as it is called. And we can do that by using wx.boxsizer, and we will then need to pass in the orientation. In this case, we want the vertical layout, so we use wx.vertical to specify that vertical option. And we also create two buttons to illustrate this better. Once we have the buttons and the layout, we then need to add the buttons widgets to the layout. So we can do that by using the add method that is available on the layout. And this expects a window. In this case, it refers to the button widget, which is also considered a window. And there are a few other options here, such as the proportion, the flag, and the border as well, but we will take a look at those in a moment. For now, I'll just specify the proportion as 0. We will take a look at what that means in a second. And once we have added all of our widgets to the layout, we then need to set the layout of the entire window. We can do that by using panel.setSizer, and then we can specify the sizer that we want to use, which we have assigned to the vertical layout variable in this case. And if we run the application now, we can see that we have the two buttons stacked vertically, but right now they are taking the minimum amount of space they possibly can. But usually that is not what we want, so to allow them to take out as much space as possible, we need to use the proportion keyword argument. The proportion keyword argument refers to how much space should each widget have. In this case, since we have specified a proportion of 0, they are just taking the minimum amount of space they should take up. If we want them to take up more space, we can use a proportion of 1, for example. And in this case, since we add a proportion to 1 for both of the widgets, they will take up 50% vertically each. So if we instead specify proportion of 2 for the first button, then it will take up twice as much space as the second button in this case. We can also specify the alignment of our widget, and to do that we need to specify an option which we can pass in as the flag keyword argument, and we can then specify wx.align. And as you can see, there are a few options to choose from. Some of them will not work, and I'll explain that in a moment, but for now we will just align it to the center by using wx.align center. And what this does is that it aligns the widget to the center horizontally. But what you might have tried is to align it to the bottom, for example, and if you did that, you would have run into this error. And the reason why you run into this error is because the layout that we're using is handling how the widgets are laid out vertically already. So it's sort of handling and taking care of which widget should go at the top and which widget should go on the bottom, for example. So choosing where we want our widgets to be aligned vertically isn't something that we can enter manually in this case, since it is already handled by the layout that we have used. But we can align it anywhere horizontally, so this includes aligning it to the left, to the center, or to the right. And if you're wondering why there's even an option that allows you to do that, if it just gives you an error, it's because we can actually use a horizontal box sizer, which we will look at after we have covered the vertical box sizer. Now, within our application, you might notice that although our buttons take out as much space as they possibly can vertically, they only take up the minimum width they can, so that's the horizontal spacing. So they aren't stretched out across the entire window, which is something that you might want to do. And before I show you how you can stretch out the entire widget horizontally, I'll first change the alignment back to center for the first widget. And so to stretch out the entire button in terms of the horizontal length to let it take up as much space horizontally as possible, we can specify another option using the flag keyword argument. In this case, we'll specify WX.expand, and that just means to take up as much space as it has available to it. And the last customization that you often want to use when you're working with the boxsizer is to add some spacing around our widgets. Right now, our widgets are stacked one after another with no spacing between each other and between the window itself. So if we want to add some spacing around the entire widget, we can use the border keyword argument when we add it to the layout. So if we add a border of 10 pixels, for example, this will add a spacing of 10 pixels. But if we run our application, we do not see any spacing. That's because we need to specify where we want this border to be at, whether it's right, left, top or bottom, or all of the sides. To specify this option of where we want the border spacing to be at, we need to specify another option. But since we already have specified an option using the flag keyword argument, and we do not just want to delete that previous option, we can specify multiple options by separating them with the pipe symbol. And we can do it like so. So the other option that I'll specify is WX.on, and this essentially specifies that I want a border of 10 pixels on all sides. So this pushes in our button widget by 10 pixels on all of these sides. And we can do something similar for the second button. I'll specify a border of 20 pixels this time. And hopefully you are starting to see why working with box sizes this way is much easier than specifying the position manually. If we only want this spacing to be applied to the bottom and the right hand side, for example, we can just specify WX.bottom and separate it once again and use WX.right. And this will apply a 20 pixel spacing on both of those two sides. And just before we continue, I will show another way that we can add some spacing, and that's actually just by using vertical layout.add. And one of the ways that we can specify the options, as you can see, is that we can specify the width and the height to add some spacing within our window instead of using a widget. And the reason why this is useful, as you'll see in a moment, is that we can also give it a proportion so that our spacing also scales as the user resizes the window, and that can be really helpful. So in this case, the width doesn't matter since all of the widgets within our window are given the entire window's width, so it can really be anything. We'll just specify it as 1. But the height does matter, and that's the initial height of this spacing. I'll give it a proportion of 0 for now, and currently that just creates a 30 pixel spacing between our widgets. But we now have the option to give it a proportion of 1, for example, so that spacing also scales and increases as the user resizes the window. Alright, if we instead wanted the widgets to be laid out entirely horizontally, we can specify the option of wx.horizontal instead of vertical, and this will align all of our widgets horizontally. And for the alignment, we now have the option to, for example, align it to the bottom. And we now can't align it to the right or left, for example, since that is already taken care of by our layout. Now another way of using box sizes is to nest them. So that means to use box sizes within our box sizes. And although that might sound a little bit complicated or overwhelming, it can actually be quite helpful. So I'll just add some starter code here to create a window and 3 buttons. You can find this starter code in the GitHub link in the description below. And we will try to create a layout where there are 2 buttons horizontally laid out on top and a button below. So we will need to, and to achieve this, we will need to use a horizontal layout for the 2 buttons at the top and a vertical layout to align with the button below. And I'll first start by creating the horizontal layout that holds both of the 2 buttons at the top. I will then add both of them to it with a proportion of 1. We then want to include both the horizontal layout and the 3rd button within a vertical layout. And to do that, I'll first start by creating the vertical box sizer. And to add that horizontal layout to our vertical layout, we can just treat it like any other widget by adding it just using the add method. We can then add our 3rd button below. Finally, I will also add the vertical layout as the overall parent layout of the entire panel. And before we run it, I'll use the expand option on all of our widgets and layouts, so we can see how much space each widget is taking up. And as you can see, this allows us to achieve that horizontal layout at the top while still giving a vertical layout to the 3rd widget as well. Alright, now is the part where using layouts get a lot more useful, and that's when we start to use a GridBagSizer. There are a few GridBagSizers within WxPython, but the most useful one and the one that you probably use the most often is the GridBagSizer, so that's what I'll showcase first. Once again, you can find the starter code for this one in the same GitHub link in the description below. We will first get started by initializing our GridBagSizer, and we'll need to use the GridBagSizer class. When initializing it, we will also need to add a vertical gap and a horizontal gap like so, and you can probably already imagine what this will be. For now, we'll just set both of them to 10. We can then add buttons to the layout, but what's different here is that we can specify the position keyword argument, and it expects a tuple where we need to specify which row and column we want it to be at. For the first button, I want it to be at the top right hand corner, so I'll specify a row of 0 and a column of 0. Just keep in mind that we do not start from 1 here, so 0 here refers to the first column and the first row. For the second button, I want it to be at the 2nd row and at the first column, so the row will be 1 and the column will be 0. And for the other 2 buttons, I'll also lay them out accordingly. We will also then need to set the size of the panel to our grid layout. Currently within our application, all of the buttons take up the minimum size possible. And you probably remember that when we're using the boxsizer, the way that we get the widgets to take up as much space as possible is to set the proportion. And that's the right idea. But when we are using the grid sizes, we specify the proportions a little bit differently. And that's by using the add global column or add global row method. This method expects the ID, so this is one row or column it is. In this case, I'm using add global column, and I'll specify the first argument to 0, so that refers to making the first column global. We can also specify the proportion to scale it differently, but if we just add the ID, it will already make that particular column take up as much space as it's able to. I'll do the same for the second column. I will also expand all of the buttons. And if we run our application now, we can see that our widgets take up as much space as they possibly can in terms of the first and second column. If we do the same but for the row, then we can see that all of our buttons now take up as much space as they possibly can, both horizontally and vertically. Now that we have gotten the basics of how to use the GridBagSizer, I'll showcase a few more ways to customize it. The first is modifying the vertical and horizontal gap, and that refers to the vertical and horizontal gap respectively between all of the different widgets. When we are adding the global rows and columns, we can also specify the proportions. So if, for example, we want the second row to grow twice as much as the first one, we can specify like so. Now what's so useful about our GridBagSizer here is that we can easily modify the positioning of the different widgets. For example, if we want the fourth button to be below all of our widgets, we can just change the row. We can also allow for our widgets to span multiple columns or rows. Just to showcase this, I will make the fourth button span across 2 columns. To do that, I'll first make it start at the bottom left hand corner. So I'll give it a position of 30 to make it start at the 4th row and at the 1st column. We can then specify the span keyword argument, and that once again expects a tuple. The first value of the tuple refers to how many rows that widget takes up, and the second refers to how many columns it takes up. So if we want it to span across 2 columns, we can specify the second value to be 2, and for the row, I'll just leave that as spanning across 1 row. So just to give a quick recap, we can use the GridBagSizer to create more complex layouts, where we need to first initialize it with a vertical and a horizontal gap. We will also need to add all of our widgets and specify their position, as the row and column they should occupy. And finally, to let them expand and take up as much space either horizontally or vertically as much as possible, we can use add global row or add global column. Alright, now we'll put together everything we've learned so far and build a simple login form using a GridBagSizer as the layout. So once again, I have found this starter code linked below, and the code here essentially just creates the widgets we need. This includes the static tags for the labels, the text controls, which are the widgets that allow the user to enter some input, as well as a button to submit the login form. Let's first start by creating the GridBagSizer. I'll specify mine to have a vertical and horizontal gap of 10. I'll then add the email label, add row 0 and column 0. Password label at the second row and first column. The email input at the first row and second column. As well as the password input at the second row and second column. And finally, we have the submit button at the third row and first column with a row span of 1 and column span of 2. If we run our application now, we have a few problems. The most obvious one is that the text control and the button widgets are not expanded to take up as much space as they possibly can. So what we'll do is to make the second column a global column. And we'll also expand all of our input widgets and submit button. So we sort of have the layout we want now, but we want to create some spacing around all of our widgets. So what I'll do here is to create a 10 pixel border on all sides of all of the widgets. And just as a reminder here, we can specify multiple options by separating them with the pipe symbol. What I also want here is to create some spacing at the top. But the problem that we have here is that if we add a 50 pixel border, all of these sides that we want to have a border will also have a 50 pixel border, for example. And the way that we get around that by doing it like we did before with the boxsizer, which is by using a width and a height using the add method. In this case, the width also doesn't matter since it will just take up the entire Windows width. So I'll specify a width of 1 and a height of 30, and I'll set that position to the first row and the first column. So we will need to move every widget down one row, which I'll quickly do here. And now our application has much more white space around. Let me also just increase the size of the button. And I'll leave it at that, but I'll definitely encourage you to, for example, add your own colors like we did in the first part of this tutorial series. And just as a side note, in the next part of this tutorial, I'll showcase how to receive user input so that we can actually add functionality to login forms like this. Alright, the last thing I'll showcase is the Flex GridBagSizer, and don't worry, this isn't anything new. This is essentially just a more restricted version of the GridBagSizer that we've been using. The main difference here is that we can't specify which row and column we want the widgets to be at, and we also do not have any control over how many columns and how many rows the widgets span across. But you might run into it if you're working with other developers or if you're reading other people's code. So I'll just showcase it quickly here. We initialize it by specifying the number of columns we want, the vertical gap and the horizontal gap. So you can just specify 3 columns, for example, and the number of rows will be automatically determined by how many widgets we add. And note that we do not need to specify their position when we are using the Flex GridBagSizer. So we can't specify things like the column or row span, but we still can do things like expanding all of the widgets. We can also add and grow both rows and column. And now we have all of the buttons laid out using a grid. So this can be really useful if you want to add multiple widgets to a grid where they are of the same size, especially since you do not need to specify their position, which makes it a lot quicker to do than using the GridBagSizer, for example. Alright, here's just a quick recap so you know when to use either the boxsizer or a GridSizer. Boxsizers are really useful if you just have a simple layout. It is used to either lay all your widgets entirely vertically or horizontally. So if you just want to get a quick alignment with an input widget and a label, a boxsizer is more suitable for such a use case. But most of the time you would usually want something more complex, and in that case a GridSizer would be much more suitable. This is because you are able to have final control over where the widgets are positioned and if they span across multiple rows and columns, for example. And you can realistically use them for anything from calculators to login forms to basically most designs that you could think of. Alright, that's all for this video. In the next one, we will look at how to handle events such as the user clicking on a button and receiving user input such as when they enter input to a text field. And if you have any feedback or ideas or videos that you would like to see in the future, feel free to leave them in the comments below. But besides that, if you have enjoyed this video or if this video has helped you, please consider possibly liking this video or subscribing to my channel to see more such content and to help my channel out.